John Bellhouse. First is the disturbing story of a former federal correctional officer who was sentenced to 63 months in prison for his sexually abusive conduct against two female inmates at the Federal Correctional Institution, FCI, Dublin.
Putting a spotlight on what's called a toxic culture among the staff at the Federal Women's Prison in Dublin.
John Bellhouse, a former federal correctional officer, was at the center of a shocking case that rocked the Federal Correctional Institution, FCI, Dublin. Born and raised in Pleasanton, California, Bellhouse seemed like an ordinary individual, but behind his seemingly normal facade lurked a dark and disturbing secret. Bellhouse began his career as a correctional officer at FCI Dublin, an all-female, low-security federal correctional institution. Little did anyone suspect that he would abuse his position of authority and trust to commit unspeakable acts of sexual abuse against the very inmates he was supposed to protect. The timeline of Bellhouse's crimes spans from December 2019 to December 2020, during which he engaged in a series of sexual abuses and abusive sexual contact against multiple victims. The trial evidence revealed the extent of his depravity and the calculated manner in which he carried out his crimes. One victim, who was incarcerated and serving a prison sentence at FCI Dublin, fell prey to Bellhouse's custodial, supervisory, and disciplinary authority. Bellhouse took advantage of his position to sexually abuse her in various locations within the prison, including the safety warehouse and safety office. He engaged in oral sex with the victim and touched her vagina and breasts without her consent, violating her in the very spaces that were meant to ensure her safety. Another victim came forward with evidence of abusive sexual contact that occurred between October and December of 2020. These acts took place in the safety office at the FCI Dublin camp, further highlighting the audacity and brazenness of Bellhouse's actions. But the horror didn't end there. Trial evidence also revealed that Bellhouse sexually abused another inmate in 2020 and 2021. He reached through a window in her cell, grabbing her breast, and on another occasion, inserted his finger into her vagina without her consent. These acts of violation occurred while the victim was in her cell, vulnerable and defenseless after showering.
An AP investigation found FCI Dublin facility enabled years of sexual misconduct from predatory employees.
The trial not only shed light on the specific instances of abuse committed by Bellhouse, but also uncovered a pattern of manipulation and coercion. In a memorandum filed in connection with Bellhouse's sentencing, the government provided additional information about his criminal conduct. It was revealed that Bellhouse used his ability to access everyday items such as Starbucks coffee, yarn, jewelry, and cleaning supplies as tools of manipulation. He would provide these items to his victims, coercing compliance with his demands and ensuring their silence. The possession of these items was considered contraband within the prison, exposing the victims to potential punishment if they were discovered. The shocking revelations of Bellhouse's crimes sent shockwaves through the justice system and the community at large. The case not only exposed the extent of the abuse that occurred within FCI Dublin, but also raised questions about the effectiveness of the system in preventing such heinous acts. The fact that Bellhouse was able to carry out his crimes for an extended period without detection or intervention is deeply troubling. The impact on the victims cannot be overstated. The trauma they endured at the hands of someone entrusted with their care and well-being is unimaginable. The legal proceedings surrounding John Bellhouse's case were a crucial step towards holding him accountable for his heinous crimes. After being initially charged with sexual abuse of an inmate on February 17, 2022, a federal grand jury issued a superseding indictment on September 29, 2022. The indictment charged Bellhouse with 2 counts of sexual abuse of a ward and 3 counts of abusive sexual contact, encompassing the period between December 2019 and December 2020. The trial that followed was a harrowing ordeal, as the evidence presented painted a disturbing picture of Bellhouse's actions. The jury, after careful consideration, found Bellhouse guilty on all counts, leaving no doubt about his guilt. The conviction was a significant victory for the victims and a testament to the strength of their testimonies and the thoroughness of the investigation. The sentencing hearing, presided over by U.S. District Judge Yvonne Gonzalez-Rogers, marked a crucial moment in the pursuit of justice. On that day, Bellhouse was sentenced to 63 months in prison, a sentence that reflected the severity of his crimes. In addition to the prison term, he was also ordered to serve 5 years of supervised release and pay a $25,000 special assessment. The sentencing hearing was attended by Deputy Attorney General Lisa O. Monaco, who emphasized the importance of holding Bellhouse accountable for his actions. She stated, "John Bellhouse exploited his position of trust at the Federal Bureau of Prisons by sexually abusing multiple women in his custody, and today he has been held to account. Monaco's words echoed the sentiment of many who believed that justice had been served. The severity of Bell House's crimes was further underscored by the statements made by FBI Deputy Director Paul Abate. Abate condemned Bell House's actions as cruel and despicable, highlighting the breach of trust and authority that he had committed. Abate reassured the public that the FBI and its partners would relentlessly pursue those who physically harm others and hold them accountable. The sentencing hearing also provided an opportunity for the victims to share their impact statements, giving voice to the trauma they had endured. Their statements were powerful and heartbreaking, shedding light on the lasting effects of Bell House's abuse. Their courage in coming forward and facing their abuser in court was commendable and played a crucial role in securing his conviction. The sentencing of Bell House was a significant milestone in the pursuit of justice, but it was not the end of the story. The government's memorandum highlighted ongoing investigations into sexual abuse at FCI Dublin, indicating a commitment to pursuing justice for all victims of abuse at the hands of correctional officers. The case against Bell House was just one piece of a larger puzzle, and efforts to address the systemic issues within the prison system were ongoing. Gregory Rodriguez. Next is Gregory Rodriguez, a former guard at the Central California Women's Facility, CCWF, who is at the center of a shocking case that has exposed rampant sexual abuse within the California prison system. In April 2014, an investigation into the alleged sexual abuse by Gregory Rodriguez, a guard at the Central California Women's Facility, CCWF, was initiated. This investigation, which would span several years, shed light on the shocking extent of Rodriguez's abuse and the systemic failures that allowed it to persist. The investigation began when a report was filed regarding overfamiliarity and a sexual relation between Rodriguez and an incarcerated woman. However, instead of terminating Rodriguez, CCWF opted to punish the victim, revealing a disturbing pattern of protecting the abuser rather than the survivors. Court records indicate that the investigation into Rodriguez's abuse was mishandled, allowing him to continue his reign of terror within the prison walls. Despite the initial report in 2014, Rodriguez was able to commit dozens of additional alleged sexual assaults over the years, preying on vulnerable women who had no means of escape. The failure of the initial investigation highlights the challenges faced by incarcerated women when reporting abuse. Fear of retaliation, disbelief, and the power dynamics within the prison system often discourage survivors from coming forward. As the investigation continued, more survivors began to speak out, shedding light on the extent of Rodriguez's abuse. These brave women shared their stories, detailing the manipulation, coercion, and violence they endured at the hands of a trusted correctional officer. Their testimonies painted a harrowing picture of a system that failed to protect its most vulnerable population. The investigation also revealed the complicity of some prison staff members in facilitating Rodriguez's abuse. Some guards appeared suspicious of Rodriguez's actions, but failed to intervene, allowing the abuse to continue unchecked. Others actively helped Rodriguez secure time alone with prisoners or intimidated victims themselves. The collusion of these individuals further perpetuated a culture of silence and fear within CCWF. The investigation into Rodriguez's abuse gained momentum in 2022, leading to his eventual arrest and the filing of 96 sexual abuse charges against him. The charges encompassed a range of offenses, including rape and violent sexual assault. The sheer number of charges highlights the magnitude of the abuse endured by the women at CCWF.
Alleging 39 individual sexual assaults, some of those charged more than one way.
Some of these counts include rape, threatening with the use of authority, and multiple counts of sexual battery.
The survivors of Gregory Rodriguez's abuse at the Central California Women's Facility, CCWF, faced immense challenges when speaking out about their experiences. Their stories shed light on the devastating consequences they endured for daring to confront their abuser and seek justice. Many of the survivors initially felt trapped and powerless, fearing retaliation and disbelief if they were to report the abuse. Rodriguez had manipulated them into silence, using his position of authority to coerce and intimidate. He made it clear that no one would believe them, exploiting the vulnerability and isolation that comes with being incarcerated. When survivors did find the courage to report the abuse, they were met with severe consequences. Instead of being protected, they were often punished, further victimizing them and perpetuating a culture of silence. In some cases, reporting abuse led to longer prison terms, increased exposure to their assailant, and even solitary confinement. One survivor, Valerie, shared her harrowing experience of being interrogated by prison prison investigators as if she were to blame for the abuse. She had been groomed, coerced, and repeatedly assaulted by Rodriguez, but the investigators failed to see her as a victim. The questioning left her feeling helpless and terrified, leading her to withhold the truth in hopes of avoiding further repercussions. Another survivor, Jane Doe, faced a similar ordeal. After Rodriguez her, 3 officers questioned her about her whereabouts during the incident. Despite knowing that her statement was false, they did not report the incident, leaving her to suffer in silence. When she sought medical attention and requested STD and pregnancy testing, she was told she would have to admit to engaging in risky behavior and face discipline. The survivors also shared their experiences of being placed in solitary confinement as a form of retaliation. Latasha Brown, who reported abuse by Rodriguez, was subjected to multiple strip searches and degrading treatment while in isolation. She felt dehumanized and struggled with suicidal thoughts as she was treated like a perpetrator rather than a victim. The case of Gregory Rodriguez's abuse at the Central California Women's Facility, CCWF, exposes not only the actions of one individual, but also the complicity and negligence of prison leadership that allowed his abuse to continue unchecked for years. The failures of prison officials to address the reports and take appropriate action reveal a systemic breakdown that puts vulnerable women at risk. One key figure implicated in the failures is Mike Pilares, the warden at CCWF during the reported Pilares is accused of failing to protect the women from a serial rapist and of receiving complaints about Rodriguez prior to many of the assaults. Despite this knowledge, Pilares did not take action or launch internal affairs investigations, allowing Rodriguez to continue his reign of terror. Furthermore, Pilares himself has faced allegations of sexual misconduct. He was sued twice by female colleagues for sexual misconduct, including one case where a CCWF administrative worker accused him of coercion into sex. These allegations raise serious concerns about the leadership within the prison system and the lack of accountability for those in positions of power. The prosecution of Gregory Rodriguez marks a significant step towards justice for the survivors of his abuse at the Central California Women's Facility, CCWF. The charges brought against Rodriguez, totaling 96 counts, including and violent sexual assault, reflect the severity of his crimes and the impact they had on the lives of the survivors. The legal proceedings offer a glimmer of hope for the survivors who have bravely come forward to share their stories. The charges filed against Rodriguez are a testament to their courage and determination to seek justice. The prosecution sends a powerful message that no one is above the law, regardless of their position or authority. The outcome of the trial will have a significant impact on the survivors' healing process. A conviction would not only bring a sense of justice, but also provide validation for their experiences. It would send a powerful message that their voices matter and that their suffering will not be ignored.
And if convicted, he could face up to 300 years in prison.
David Lowe. Next is the story of David Lowe, a former jail officer at Clark County Jail, whose actions unleashed a wave of terror upon the female inmates. In October 2021, a day that would forever change the lives of the inmates and the community surrounding the Clark County Jail. On that fateful day, Lowe, a former jail officer, was apprehended and charged with a series of heinous crimes that would send shockwaves through the entire justice system. Lowe's arrest came after a thorough investigation by law enforcement officials, who uncovered a disturbing plot that involved the sale of keys to male inmates. These keys granted them access to the women's areas within the jail, setting the stage for a horrifying chain of events.
Documents say Lowe says he propped a pod door open leading to the secure area and then acted like he was taking a blood pressure reading from an inmate with his back to the main door.
The charges against Lowe were nothing short of shocking. He was accused of escape, official misconduct, and trafficking with an inmate. The gravity of these charges cannot be understated, as they shed light on the extent of Lowe's involvement in the criminal activities that unfolded within the walls of the Clark County Jail. The investigation revealed that Lowe had made a deal to sell the keys in exchange for a substantial sum of $1,000. This revelation sent shockwaves through the community, as it became clear that Lowe's actions were not only a betrayal of his position as a jail officer, but also a violation of the trust placed in him by the inmates and the public. As the case unfolded, the true extent of the damage caused by Lowe's actions began to emerge. Attorneys representing the victims revealed that the men who gained access to the women's areas threatened the female inmates with harm if they dared to call for help. Tragically, at least 2 women fell victim to rape, their lives forever scarred by the traumatic experiences they endured. The charges against Lowe painted a picture of a man who had not only abused his power, but had also contributed to a systemic failure within the Clark County Jail. The attorneys argued that the violation of the plaintiff's constitutional rights was not solely the result of Lowe's actions, but also a result of the sheriff's office's failure to properly staff, train, and supervise the jail officers. In response to the charges, the attorneys for the sheriff's office and officers put forth a different narrative. They claimed that Lowe, accused of selling the keys, was not acting under color of state law. They vehemently denied any liability on the part of the defendants and even went as far as to assert that the women were not assaulted.
Not one person in that pot, and I was 4 on a stack of bottles, screamed, help me, or anything. None of that.
The clash of narratives set the stage for a legal battle that would determine the fate of the victims and the accountability of those involved. The initial civil actions included then-Sheriff Jamie Knoll, who was in office until December of 2021. However, with the transition of power, Scotty Maples, the newly elected sheriff, is now listed in the lawsuits in his official capacity. As the criminal trial looms on the horizon, the victims anxiously await justice. The shocking details of Lowe's crimes will be laid bare in the courtroom as the community grapples with the aftermath of the systemic failure that allowed these atrocities to occur. The impact on the victims cannot be overstated. These women, already serving their sentences, found themselves in a vulnerable position, relying on the system to protect them. Instead, they were subjected to a nightmare of assault and threats, leaving them traumatized and scarred for life. Attorneys representing the victims have shed light on the harrowing experiences these women endured. They revealed that the men who gained access to the women's areas, armed with the keys sold by Lowe, threatened the inmates with harm if they dared to call for help. The fear and intimidation they faced silenced their cries for assistance, leaving them trapped in a cycle of abuse. Tragically, at least 2 women were raped, their bodies violated, and their spirits broken. The physical and emotional scars they carry will forever serve as a painful reminder of the horrors they endured within the supposed confines of the justice system. The violation of the victims' constitutional rights is a central aspect of this case. The attorneys argue that the responsibility for these violations extends beyond the actions of David Lowe alone. They contend that the Clark County Sheriff's Office failed in its duty to properly staff, train, and supervise the jail officers, resulting in a systemic failure that allowed these atrocities to occur. The impact of these violations extends far beyond the physical and emotional trauma experienced by the victims. It strikes at the very core of our justice system, raising questions about the accountability and responsibility of those entrusted with the care and well-being of inmates. As the legal battle unfolds, the victims and their attorneys will fight tirelessly to ensure that their rights are upheld and that those responsible are held accountable. The upcoming settlement conference in the United States District Court, Southern District of Indiana, will be a pivotal moment in their pursuit of justice. If a settlement is not reached, the cases will proceed to trial, where the shocking details of Love's crimes and the systemic failures within the Clark County Jail will be exposed for all to see. The outcome of these legal proceedings will not only determine the fate of the victims, but also serve as a catalyst for change within the justice system. John Snipes, Paul Voglino, Mark Johnson, and others. Next, we will uncover the disturbing truth about the actions of John Snipes, Paul Voglino, Mark Johnson, and others. These individuals, who were entrusted with the responsibility of maintaining order and safety within the prison walls, have been accused of engaging in heinous acts of sexual abuse against female inmates. The extent of their crimes is truly shocking, as they abused their positions of power to coerce vulnerable inmates into performing sexual acts in exchange for basic necessities and privileges. These men were charged with sexually abusing female inmates. John Snipes, one of the accused correctional officers, stands out as a manipulative figure in this scandal. With his position of authority, Snipes used his power to exploit vulnerable female inmates for his gratification. The details of his actions are truly disturbing. According to the grand jury's findings, Snipes engaged in a series of coercive acts to satisfy his desires. One particularly shocking incident involved a female inmate performing a sexual act on him in her jail cell. What makes this even more appalling is the fact that other guards in the control room were complicit in his actions. By remotely clicking the cell door's lock, they would warn Snipes whenever someone was approaching, allowing him to avoid detection. The grand jury's report also revealed that Snipes was not content with just one act of abuse. He coerced specific sexual acts in certain locations within the jail, creating an environment of fear and vulnerability for the female inmates. The fact that these acts became so commonplace that the women had a slang phrase for them speaks volumes about the extent of Snipes' manipulation and the pervasive culture of abuse within the prison. The impact of Snipes' actions on the victims cannot be overstated. Female inmates, already in a vulnerable position, were subjected to further trauma and exploitation at the hands of someone they should have been able to trust. The fear of retaliation and the knowledge that their complaints would be ignored silenced their voices, leaving them trapped in a cycle of abuse. The charges against Snipes reflect the severity of his crimes. If convicted, he could face decades in prison, a consequence that is well deserved given the harm he has inflicted upon these vulnerable vulnerable individuals. It is crucial for the justice system to hold him accountable and send a strong message that such abuse will not be tolerated. Paul Voglino, another accused correctional officer in this scandal, emerges as a predatory figure who used his position of authority to exploit and victimize female inmates. The details surrounding Voglino's actions are deeply disturbing and shed light on the extent of his predatory behavior. According to the grand jury's investigation, Voglino engaged in a pattern of sexual abuse, preying on the vulnerability of the female inmates under his supervision. He used his power to coerce these women into performing sexual acts in exchange for basic necessities and privileges within the prison. Mark Johnson, one of the accused correctional officers in this scandal, emerges as a violator of trust, using his position of authority to exploit and abuse vulnerable female inmates. The details surrounding Johnson's actions are deeply troubling and shed light on the extent of his betrayal. According to the grand jury's investigation, Johnson engaged in a series of abusive acts, taking advantage of his power to coerce sexual acts from the female inmates under his supervision. These acts were not isolated incidents, but rather part of a pattern of exploitation and manipulation. The shocking scandal involving John Snipes, Paul Voglino, Mark Johnson, and others goes beyond the actions of a few individual correctional officers. It exposes a persistent culture of abuse that has plagued the prison system for over a decade. This culture of abuse is a systemic failure that has allowed these heinous acts to occur and persist unchecked. The grand jury's investigation into the prison revealed a disturbing pattern of exploitation and manipulation. Female inmates were subjected to sexual abuse, coercion, and harassment by the very individuals who were supposed to ensure their safety and well-being. The fact that these abuses were widely known among the guards hints at a culture of silence and complicity that allowed the abuse to continue. The grand jury's report revealed that the guards traded commissary items, food, cigarettes, and extra phone time for sexual favors. This transactional nature of the abuse highlights the power dynamics at play and the vulnerability of the inmates. The guards took advantage of their positions of authority to exploit and manipulate these vulnerable individuals. What is particularly alarming is the complicity of other guards within the prison. The grand jury found that some guards were aware of the abuse and even assisted in covering it up. This complicity suggests a deeply ingrained culture of silence and a failure to report these abuses to the appropriate authorities. The lack of action taken to address these assaults is deeply troubling and raises serious concerns about the prison's administration. The impact of this persistent culture of abuse on the victims cannot be overstated. Female inmates, already stripped of their freedom and autonomy, were subjected to further trauma and violation. The fear of retaliation and the knowledge that their complaints would be ignored silenced their voices, leaving them trapped in a cycle of abuse. The failure of the prison system to protect these vulnerable individuals is a grave injustice. The charges faced by Snipes, Voglino, Johnson, and others reflect the severity of their crimes. If convicted, they could face significant prison sentences. However, it is crucial to recognize that holding a few individuals accountable is not enough. The systemic failures that allowed this culture of abuse to persist must be addressed. The grand jury's report highlighted the lack of action taken by prison officials when complaints of abuse were made. Female inmates who dared to report the abuse were met with indifference and had their complaints ignored. This failure to address the assaults allowed the abuse to persist, leaving the victims without recourse or support. The allegations made in the federal lawsuit filed by 4 former inmates further underscore the lack of action taken by prison officials. The lawsuit claims that high-ranking county and prison officials, including the warden, conspired to cover up the assaults. It alleges that officials were aware of the continuous sexual assault endured by female inmates for over a decade, yet failed to take any meaningful action to stop it. One particularly alarming allegation in the lawsuit involves Warden Timothy Betty, who was then an assistant warden. It is claimed that Betty tore up an inmate's abuse complaints and sent officers to destroy the evidence. This deliberate attempt to silence the victims and cover up the abuses is deeply disturbing and highlights the complicity of prison officials in perpetuating the culture of abuse. Of the accused, Jeffrey Staff has been sentenced to 9 months probation, acting after pleading no contest to 1 count of official oppression. The court also barred him from ever seeking employment in law enforcement or prison. Thanks for watching. Click on the videos on your screen for similar content.